outcome of their appeal is known, as long as they do not face serious irreversible harm at home. It will also cut the numbers of grounds for appeal against deportation from 17 to 4, so it will speed up the process quite quickly.
Wow.
It will also compel landlords to check whether tenants are in the UK illegally, or those failing to do so will face large fines. So I think that was something quite similar was done already with employers. Wow. So if you employ someone who's an illegal immigrant, you face a fine, and now this will extend to landlords too, which I think it's quite good. You should know your tenants.
I don't know. Call me old-fashioned, but whenever the government delegates or sort of puts its own responsibilities onto the general public, it always rings alarm bells with me.
Do you think so?
I think so. So I'm just trying to visualise the scenario where a landlord is saying to a potential tenant, prove your immigration status here.
But I guess it'd be good to have their documentation. I mean, that should be a requirement anyway.
I mean, how would the government police something like that? You can see how a landlord could easily do that, show me your passport or your documentation. But if the government wants to do it, there's so many people around.
Maybe it's just naivety, right? But I think there's a geographical factor in our favour. This is a tiny island. How did they get here in the first place if it wasn't by getting past customs, security, immigration controls? There are so many controls to try and prevent people coming into this tiny little island, isn't it? And once they're here, I think, is it the police or the government admitting their inability to police this aspect of the law?
No, that sounds reasonable. I mean, if they were... If that part of the law was, being enforced tightly, we wouldn't have these situations or these cases.
Yeah. But I guess lots of people do come here on, say, student visas or other different types of visas, and once that expires, they then kind of fall into a black hole. I mean, there was a BBC Two documentary about it recently, about immigrants that stay here, they destroy all their paperwork, so then they can't really be sent back because, say, for example, if they're from India, the Indian embassy won't process their documentation, but then they don't have rights to be here anyway, so they're kind of in no man's land.
Yeah, and it's, I don't know if you can remember, but just towards the end of the last government, there was a big hoo-ha about the fact that nobody really knew how many illegal immigrants there were, how many students had overstayed their visa limits, and it was really a question of, well, can we define what the problem is before we can resolve it? And nobody seemed to have an answer as to how many people are here and they shouldn't be here.
Yeah.
So things falling down, I think, in that little area.
Well, I think so, but I guess if you make it tougher for those to live here which don't have the relevant documentation, it will then make it kind of harder for them to live here, so then they will have to go back.
Yeah. This is an interesting one for a colonial country with a colonial ancestry. It sort of looks like it's chickens coming home to roost, isn't it?
I think so. But then watching the BBC Two documentary was really sad, though, for those immigrants that are here and who are here illegally.
Yes.
They don't have any sort of respite, they don't have anywhere to live, they can't work here because they're illegal. Then the appeal system takes such a long time that they can't be sent back to their home places, even though they want to. So maybe this bill, if it would speed it up a bit, it might help them, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So what would happen in that case if you can't get sent back to home then? And obviously the UK doesn't want to keep you. What would happen to these people in no man's land? Say they got caught.
If they got caught, I think they're in, I'm not too sure about the details of this, but it's some sort of detention centre or a centre whilst they're waiting to be sent back. Yeah.
Okay, so that must be a really big drain on, public resources as well then.
Exactly, so if, the appeal time or the appeal process can be shortened down, it might be better for both parties, for the Home Office and for the immigrants themselves.
You do know, though, there is a historical precedent to this. There was a time when criminals were deemed to be undesirable, and so they shipped them all off to Australia, didn't they?
That is true.
We have history repeating itself.
Yeah, well, interesting topic. If anyone's listening out there who's got strong views, feel free to text in on the text line. The number is 07961 387 787. Or you can call us on the studio number, which is 0208 472 9292. Or drop us a tweet at nusound92FM. We'll be interested to hear what you think.
I also thought it was really interesting that there was an amendment about this whole right to respect for private life, for family life, which didn't go through because it was by the Tory backbench. What do you guys think about that?
Could you just expand on that a little bit? Right to family life?
Basically, if a foreign criminal comes to the UK and commits a crime, and they are then going to be deported, they plead to the right to family life. So if they've got a girlfriend here, if they've got a family here, if they've got children here, they then plead their human rights under Article 8, which is the right to respect for family life and private life. So then they say they can't be deported back to their home country because they'll lose their rights for family life because their family's in the UK.
Can't you ship their family back as well?
Or if the family's living here, has a job here, if their kids are in school here, how can they just uproot and go because one person's committed? That's what they argue.
Sure, I've always felt that, if someone commits a serious crime, right, and doesn't really take into account other people's rights in committing that crime, I'm not entirely sure it's justified that they can appeal to other rights.
I don't think so. They shouldn't be able to. And also, what's really interesting, that 400 cases each year go through where criminals plead to Article 8 and are successful, which is quite a worrying statistic.
But the difficulty with that argument, that a person should only come to, I think in law they used to call it, a person should only come to the law if they have clean hands, otherwise they are not eligible to receive the protection of the law.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is that it assumes that the legal system is flawless, right? But we have too many cases of people passing through the legal system and then being judged and found to be guilty, and then a few years later you have the Birmingham 4, the Rochdale 6, the Manchester United 14, or whatever they are, and then suddenly it's found that it was a complete miscarriage of justice. So you can't use that. I don't think you can use that as a default argument.
No, I can see your point, and I'd agree with the stronger rights. But I mean, I think the softer rights, for example, this right to family privacy, I think is definitely a softer right than some of the other ones.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said that a person needs to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions.
Definitely. I mean, there's always a clause. I mean, in every human right, the first clause states their right, and the second right says that, only if it's in the interest of society, if it's for the economic well-being of the country and for the prevention of disorder and crime. So if these criminals are pleading Article 8, but then they're still allowed to go through, and, subsection 2 isn't taken into consideration, then I think it's the judges, the judiciary maybe, who aren't taking that into consideration and are, thinking actually their right to family life supersedes the interests of society and crime.
Well, I think I would have been a lot happier bashing the judges and if we hadn't had Joe on the show last week.
Oh, we have to get him back and ask him about this.
I think Joe did a really good job on all of us, and we have a lot more respect for the judiciary, and we'll give them a bit more time, and maybe they're not all completely head in the clouds and not connected with reality.
But if 400 cases a year are coming
that's a lot of cases.
It's an alarming figure.
That's a lot of cases. I think that's a valid observation, that if you're in the country, then you subscribe to its laws, and if you don't subscribe to its laws, then possibly your presence here may not be as desirable as you think it is.
Yeah, no, I agree.
We've got a text come through from Anoop. He said, "I'm utterly astounded that the government can snoop on the common man, yet cannot keep tabs on immigration."
Thank you for that, Anoop. First text and caller of the day, and we just hope that your real name is Anoop, and you have a right to participate in this conversation. But no, thank you for that. You're absolutely right. There are many cases where the government's capacity to observe unbelievably fine details has been brought into the forefront of our awareness after the July bombings. It was just stunning that they would have footage of random individuals getting off at railway stations, and suddenly a case could be put together to accuse, to justify, and then to give evidence for their movements. And yet, if, as Nubri says, if you try and find out who is eligible to be here, suddenly there is a silence, isn't there?
They could always get in touch with the NSA. I hear they're good at that.
Okay, so you think they do really know, but they just don't want to tell us?
I'm not sure. I think it's a drain on resources, right? I think there's high priority things and low priority things, and this invasion of privacy is usually justified, in being the interests of national security.
And you could always argue, if you've got nothing to hide, then why are you fearful of your privacy being invaded?
Oh, no.
I don't like that argument.
We don't like that argument at all.
I think so.
An Englishman's home is his castle, and nobody needs to know what's going on in his castle.
But if nothing wrong is going on in his castle, then so what if the authorities know about it?
But who watches the watchers?
Yeah, I think that's the
That's
thing.
a good question.
1984 revisited. That's an old argument. But so we're talking about immigration and the right of people to be here. I can't get away from this notion that whenever election season is around the corner, immigration appears on the table, and it's not just here. I don't know whether you're aware, but there's an amendment to an immigration bill that's been presented in the United States as well.
Oh, okay.
And so all of a sudden we have two people who are party to what's called a special relationship, both talking about immigration.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's an odd one, isn't it?
I mean, it's brought up, I'd imagine, around election time, because it's probably thought that a lot of people have strong opinions and strong views on immigration, and we can see that recently. I mean, this whole debate about, what was it Bulgaria?
Yeah, Bulgaria and Romania.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge debate. The discussion just went on for ages, and at the end, when they eventually let Bulgaria and Bulgarians in, hardly any came through. It was...
I mean, I was speaking to someone from Ramfel, who's a charity, immigration charity, and they said they only had one Romanian come to them after, the borders opened up. So I don't think there was a massive influx as the media portrayed.
No, I'm convinced that it's hyped out of proportion, really.
I think so.
It's election season. Let's rally the troops and dig up the old differences and see what we can pick up as a piece in between.
Yeah. I've got a question though. Why do you think this immigration is such a emotive, charged topic? What is it that people don't like about it? I mean, isn't it good to have a nice mix of people, provided they're legal? It's you're aiming for.
Provided they're legal and don't commit any crimes, I think it's brilliant having immigration. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, it's a very valid question. I think traditionally, it's always the foundation of this argument has always been limited resources. Yeah, it's that poverty mentality which says we haven't got enough to go around, and so what we need to do is we need to ration it between those who deserve it and have a right to it and those who don't.
Right, so it's just a question of who deserves it then and who has a right to it.
Yeah, and I do think that this whole notion of not enough resources to go around, that really needs looking at again. In the 21st century, we're in the first world in this country, and are we not able to cope and cater for everybody who's here and their needs? I don't think that's a problem.
Well, no, I mean, you think about it, there are limits. I mean, we don't have much space, first of all, in this country, right?
Especially in London. I think London is getting very overpopulated. But then England is an island, but then there are other places as well, which could do with regeneration and...
Yeah, there's all of Lancashire. we don't go as far as Yorkshire, do we? There's also all of Yorkshire waiting to be discovered.
We've just had a couple of texts in. We've got one from Satnam from Ilford. He said over 7,000 people are lost in the black hole, especially from... 700,000 people, so
wow.
a large figure, are lost in the black hole, especially from Nigeria, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan. So there are lots of people who are lost in the system.
And maybe a handful of Bulgarians as well.
I'm not sure. They can be here legally now. So.
And they don't really seem to be much interested either, to be honest.
Yeah.
I know, the figures are shocking. So I don't know, maybe this immigration bill might be able to help those who are lost in the system.
Okay, so you've identified that the aspect of repatriation because of criminal activity seems to be the main driving force behind this interest in immigration. Yeah? But the numbers, have you come across any numbers to indicate how many people might be in that category? Because it's like the old argument, isn't it? The whole immigration thing can be put against Johnny Foreigner. Right, when in fact there were only 30 people last year who, and that's not the figure, I'm obviously just making it up, who actually this legislation would affect. Do you have any idea for the scale of that? Is it this 700,000?
Unfortunately, I don't. Unfortunately, I'm not an immigration expert. I've just been watching this immigration bill quite closely.
Yeah.
And I saw the BBC Two documentary, and I've interviewed someone who's from a charity organisation helping immigrants. But apart from that, I have no idea of the figures. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, so is it possible that the government's doing what it's done recently in many cases, where it legislates first and then, we'll get the data afterwards? That's the hard work.
I'm sure the government have done their homework, surely. We'd hope. I mean, if anyone has any views on this, our text number is 07961 387 787. You can also call us on the studio. The number is 808 472 9292. And you can also tweet us at nusound92fm. I think we've just had some texts come through.
Yes, we have. So Mr. Singh has texted in saying, if you have signed to the Human Rights Charter, then you can't ill-treat anyone.
Thank you very much.
Human
rights do protect human rights. We can't ill-treat people, but then...
I think it all comes down to what you define as ill-treating someone. I think that's a very grey area. And
I guess if someone's done something wrong and they're a criminal, then they should be treated as a criminal because they've lost their right, to live a free life.
Yeah, up to a point.
I quite agree with that. I think it's a fundamental principle. Was it Plato who said good people don't need laws and bad people will always find a way around them?
Yeah,
that's true.
Right? And so So putting legislation into place really does require enforcement of it.
Definitely.
And if that enforcement is perhaps draconian or is a little oppressive or ill treatment even, then I think there is an element of personal responsibility in that as well. So although I see what Mr. Singh is referring to, but I think the emphasis and the balance should be with the victim and
Definitely.
not so much with the perpetrator.
Yeah. We've actually had another text just come in from Ajit. Ajit says, if you support war in other countries, then there will be a fallout and there will be refugees that the country will need to take in.
I think asylum seekers and refugees are very different from illegal immigrants, because refugees have a right to be here, and the government had said that they'll be taking in refugees from Syria who are the most vulnerable, so women and children.
Ajiti, thank you for that text. I think that's really touched on a very sensitive and very important point. Foreign policy does affect other people's rights, does affect other people's lives. And if you are going to apply and impose foreign policies which act to their detriment, then it's not unreasonable to expect that some part of it's going to come back to you.
Definitely.
I think it's quite tough actually with these sorts of situations when you're talking about asylum seekers and refugees, because there's all sorts of atrocities being carried out in different parts of the world, and there's a lot of people suffering. And I think it's a hard balance to play. You know, who, like you said, Prerna, you know, the people who most need the help. Who are the people who most need the help? It's really hard to identify those people. And how are you going to identify those people and then take care of them here? Like you said, you know, the people in the black hole or the illegal immigrants, you know, are having problems here.
Yeah.
You know, even a lot of my friends can't find jobs as it is. You know, it's
premier institution graduates, and there is another angle to this asylum issue, though. I don't know whether you have followed the recent concerns that the host community in this country have been voicing about Christian minorities in other countries. And
I know there's been problems in Egypt with the Christian minority.
And in Syria as well.
Oh, okay.
And now suddenly there is a conversation going on that the asylum and immigration legislation shouldn't perhaps apply in exactly the same way to these minorities. And you were mentioning at the moment, who do you give asylum to? How do you decide the priorities? And in this particular debate with regard to the Christian minorities in Syria, there was a balanced opinion. There were people who were Christians from Syria saying, by highlighting that we are asylum seekers and that we are a minority in Syria, you make it harder for us to survive in Syria. We want to stay there. We don't want to leave.
It seems that they're being given preferential treatment.
That's right. So this whole notion of immigration, I think politicians and vested interests, they also colour it a little bit according to what their pet loyalties are. That's another aspect of what your history teaches about this whole movement and asylum debate.
Well, I think it's time for a short advert break, and we look forward to hearing your views on the other side. Hi, this is Prerna. Join Satish, Vivek and I for Reasonable Conversation. Have your say every Sunday, 12 to 1, exploring controversial topics on nusound Radio. You're tuned into A Reasonable Conversation on nusound Radio 92 FM with myself, Prerna, Vivek and Satish. We've just been talking about immigration, and on the phone we have Gurpal Uppal, who's an immigration specialist. He's a solicitor at Charles Simmons Immigration Solicitors. Hi, Gurpal.
Hello, good morning, Prerna, to the rest of you guys.
Good morning.
Hi.
Welcome to the show.
Interesting topic. A topic which is probably very close to my heart, because I've been practicing both asylum, human rights, and immigration for the last sort of 15-odd years.
Excellent.
And it's funny, each time I hear people talking about immigration and asylum, sometimes it does frustrate me how sometimes people in the public as a whole can take the whole sort of issue out of context and not quite realise what the whole impact can be on a community and to a country as a whole. And it's very easy for, I think, for listeners and basically Joe public as a whole to sort of come almost very xenophobic whenever someone starts talking about immigration and asylum as a whole.
That's phenomenal. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
No, just to paraphrase what you said, often immigration only appears in the public's perception and mind in the run-up to election season, and so, you know, what's presented by the various parties does tend to have a little bit of a xenophobic aspect to it, doesn't it? But
don't forget, when the Conservative Party came through, a lot of arguments have been put forward that part of the reason that they won the last election or came forward from Labour was the fact that they probably took immigration more seriously than some of the other parties did.
Definitely.
And their pledge has always been from day one is that they're going to try and reduce net migration from hundreds of thousands to less than hundreds of thousands.
I mean, just to ask you a quick question, have you seen an impact on the ground with all these new policies that the Conservative parties have bring in? I mean, is there a decrease in immigration, or is there a decrease in the problem? How bad is it?
Well, from day one, what I've seen from the Conservative point of view, they've certainly brought a lot of policies in where they've tried to reduce the number of people come to UK. And we can talk everything from the number of students that have been coming in, because initially there was all these colleges, there was a lot of bogus colleges opening up, people allowed to get their sort of student visas just by simply showing that they've got funds and an admission from a college. That all became a lot more stricter.
That's right.
From a marriage point of view, if you want to call your wife to the UK, you've now got to show 18,600, which meant that settlement application was supposed to drop down from roughly about 65,000 to nearly half. Rights of appeals for visitors, they've now been taken away from. We've had something called the HN7P, which was a Tier 1 skilled migrant program. That's been taken away.
That's right.
I think the only problem that the UK have had so far is Europe. All the policies that the UK government brought into place have affected those from outside of Europe. But Europe's one sort of entity which they're struggling with. 1st of January saw Bulgaria and Romania joining the European Union. And running up to the 1st of January, I think media as a whole really had a backlash against the Romanians and the Bulgarians, how they're going to flood through into the country. They're going to take away our jobs. They're going to take away all the services that we've got, from the schooling all the way to the NHS. But don't forget, I mean, the Bulgarians and Romanians have the right to be there. And I think the sort of, what I'm going to say, xenophobic thing once again was sort of hyped up probably more than there was. And even from the asylum seekers, don't forget, any asylum seeker is someone who fears persecution in the home country, either because of race, religion, ethnic background. And people that want to come to the UK and adopt the route of asylum, sometimes you will get this asylum seekers as well as genuine ones. Yes. But don't forget, England's an island. I mean, I often say if you cover your thumb over England on the map, you'll be able to cover it. Places like Canada, you can put your whole hand from your finger to your thumb and you won't be able to cover it. But yet, England seems to be the attraction where everyone seems to come to. Maybe it's the past, maybe because we've been soft, we've been able to give out handouts, we've been able to give permission to work to people who come here, and obviously then the vibes go back to people's home countries that, well, hold on, if you come to England, you'll get yourself benefits, you'll get yourself jobs. And
exactly. Now, Britain is seen as a soft touch.
It's probably seen as one of the premier directions that asylum seekers and also illegal immigrants head for, isn't it?
I'm always surprised how people, I mean, if you look at people coming from the other side of Africa, from the Far East, they're able to come all the way to England, and they're going through Europe, and they're going through all the other countries en route. And why would such a destination be so popular? But then you've got to look at geographical issues and historical patterns of how people have moved to UK. And obviously, if you've got a group of people living in one area, then the message will slowly filter back. Look, come here, we'll be able to look after you. And that means both family, government policy as a whole. But each government's obviously had its own agenda and own policies. And I suppose you've got to take each policy individually from each government to see what's going on. And with the coalition government, don't forget the Liberals did sort of mention at the very beginning, we may consider an amnesty for all those people that are here. And even today, if you look at the figures in terms of how many people are illegal, we don't have a fixed figure. Some people say it's in excess of 500,000. People often talk about that there's the Bermuda Triangle in the UK, when people come along and make an asylum application, make an immigration application, get refused, and suddenly they disappear again. I remember reading one report saying that they asked the UK Border Agency executive, do you reckon you'll ever actually clear the issue of the illegal people in the UK? And I think the answer that came back was probably no. And even if you did try and sort of tackle the issue, how long would it take? And it was like 30-odd plus years. We've had issues in the past where we've had employees, cleaners at the UK Border Agency that have been illegal. So when you think of overall the types of things that are going on and the reports that come through, especially from the Home Select Committee, which is chaired by Keith Faz, you can really see the extent of the problems that the immigration system has in the UK. And
I mean, do you think this... So I was just going to say, do you think this new immigration bill will help these problems? Do you see any benefits in it?
I think the biggest thing that we need to probably do is the enforcement side. I mean, the bill's talked about clamping down and even more on landlords, finding landlords who keep illegal renters. They're clamping down even more on employers who keep people employed. I suppose those stringent efforts need to be done to deter people to come here, and I suppose the efforts of the government is to make life so hard for an illegal person already staying in the UK that the message will eventually go back is, well, hold on, there's no point being in the UK, there's no point coming to the UK. If I talk about India as a whole, the past few years when I used to go to India, a lot of people wanted to come to the UK to study, and I'm sure a lot of those people come to the UK to study weren't probably genuine students. They probably looked at the student as a route to come to the UK. They no longer look at UK no more because they know that in the UK students are no longer able to get work easily. They're no longer able to apply for their partners to come to UK easily enough.
Yeah, there's been quite a reversal, hasn't there? And
so people are now started going towards Australia and New Zealand. So government policies, stringent actions do eventually have an impact, but it's the filter effect. How long will it have an effect? And with the elections around the corner, obviously the Conservative government are going to try as hard as possible to make sure that all the policies they've brought in have had an effect, so they can stick to the figures and show the figures what's happened with net migration. And I think to that extent, yes, they have had an impact, but it's the public perception that probably counts more than anything else. And the other parties have certainly picked up on the fact that maybe you're seeing more Europeans come to the UK, you probably see more students come to the UK, and physically you see more people in the surgeries, you see more people in the schools which aren't, I'll say, UK-based. Even to the point, I think Punjabis, Indians as a whole complain there's too many Poles, there's too many Europeans taking our jobs. We can't...
Conveniently forgetting that we used to be, the immigrants from last generation.
You guys, it'll be surprised the number of times I have conversations and I think, hold on, I'm sure that the English used to say this about the Indians when they first came across, and then the Caribbeans when they first came across.
I just think there are too many English people here, really. So much more room for everyone.
I mean...
Who is an Englishman these days?
Exactly. I mean, earlier on we were talking about foreign criminals who come here and then plead Article 8, the right to family life, to stay in this country. I mean, do you find in the legal world that Article 8 is being abused by these people?
The wonderful thing that we have in the UK, which we'll never forget, is our judicial system, our rule of law in this country. Every person who's in the UK has a right. Now, if you have a right, obviously you can present your right, and that will be challenging. If you want to challenge him further, you have a judicial procedure by which you can adopt. If you're talking about should we have the Human Rights Act or should we opt out of the Human Rights Act, I think that's probably a long topic in itself.
Definitely.
I would certainly say every person has his right to protect himself, to put forward his plea. Sometimes what you have is you will have advisors will abuse the system, the legal system, to the maximum, just to sort of let someone stay here. And I suppose lawyers as a whole, including myself, we have a duty of care towards our clients and towards the system as a whole. But then who's guilty and who's not guilty? Still proven guilty.
I have a question for you. And one of the things that politicians are often accused of is dreaming up policies which have a high profile and yet minimum contribution. And in your own experience, have you actually come across an instance where perhaps a person who was acknowledged as being a criminal managed to successfully use something like Section 8 and stay here? Is this happening as frequently as the politicians would seem to suggest, or is it a lot of smoke with no fire?
It does happen, and the government has started coming down hard. I mean, I come across examples in terms of case studies all the time. I think more than Article 8 and probably the human rights element, I think what people sometimes forget is there's another element, which is Europeans in the UK coming along and people then marrying Europeans, because people then adopt almost a second rule, a second law, which then kicks in, and sometimes people adopt them to other areas of law, apart from not just the UK sort of law, but then you've got the European law, which then gives separate rights to some people as well. But if you talk about sort of policies and whether they have an effect in whether people sort of jump on board, the government sometimes do that. I'll give a very small example. Not too long ago, the UK government almost announced that they were going to introduce a £3,000 bond for all visitors to UK, and it was announced literally over a weekend.
That's right.
And there was a big uproar, especially amongst the Indian community, about every single visitor that comes to UK is now going to have to pay £3,000. And I thought, hold on, if we break this down a bit more, someone who's been coming to UK on a regular basis, would he also have to repay the bond? Someone who's coming together with a family of four, would he have to pay 4 lots of £3,000 bonds? those from the UK going to India. Now, would the Indians start imposing bonds on the UK? So sometimes I do find that the politicians do jump on board and they come up with some crazy schemes.
It's funny you mentioned that, because that one was one particular one where I had quite a bit of involvement in. And when we dug down a little bit deeper, the way in which the political parties had taken advantage of what was a relatively innocent sort of a suggestion was unbelievable. It was so funny to watch, because I recall the original suggestion was that if an immigration officer sitting in New Delhi found somebody to be questionable, but maybe, and ordinarily he would have actually rejected him, they were only thinking of introducing an additional option. So that rather than rejecting a person who you were uncertain about, you could say, well, okay, rather than rejecting him, let's have a bit of a guarantee and see whether that will put it into place. It wasn't a blanket that everybody's grandmother would have to put £3,200 and the mungie down on the desk before they would let her in. But that's exactly what you were saying. It was the politicians decided to launch it, the politicians shut it down, and then it disappeared without a trace, didn't it?
I think the government are always going to think of schemes of how to sort of control the border, and they have every right to do so, and we have every right to be protected within the UK. But sometimes more planning does help, and you talk about the British High Commissions in Delhi. I used to go quite often to New Delhi to represent my clients before entry clearance officers. And the one thing I always did find that entry clearance officers were never always up to date with the law. They did have a sixth sense where they look at a person and say, well, this person's not going to come back, despite what you put on your document, what you show. And it can be very frustrating for those genuine people that want to come to the UK. I mean, if you look at this as a whole, the Chinese community alone contributes so much in terms of wealth as visitors to the UK, because they come and spend a lot of money.
Yes.
Once again, the Indians produce a lot of people that now work in the NHS. I read a report only a few weeks ago. If you took all the Asian doctors and nurses out of the NHS system, the NHS probably would collapse.
Definitely.
So, as a whole, policies need to be in place. They need to be controlled strictly. But I think that's where the problem's always been. There's been so much abuse of the immigration system in the UK, and sometimes the UK itself hasn't been able to control the immigration as a whole. You'll be surprised to hear, even today, there's no exit checking system. If someone comes to the UK as a visitor, as a work permit holder, as a student, there's no way of checking whether that person has actually left the country.
Oh, okay.
The system that should have been introduced by the next elections, and there was talk a little bit back that that may not come into place because of changes in policies, but luckily it has now been reintroduced again. So I think we've got to go back and probably start from basics and make sure that our enforcement and our policing and our checking system, our computer systems are strong enough and are in place to make sure we can deal with any policies that are then introduced into the systym.
Phenomenal.
Well, thank you very much, Gopal. Thank you for all that helpful information.
No problem. Do carry on.
Really
Wonderful
appreciate
topics. And I'd probably invite as many people to come along, join the conversation, add your bit, and because it's the people's opinions that are going to count in the next election.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much for your contribution. And thanks for adding some facts and figures behind the emotional rhetoric. So that was Gopal from
Charles Simmons Solicitors.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for calling, Gopal.
Take care.
Wonderful.
Bye.
So we're having a reasonable conversation about immigration, and I think whilst Gopalji was talking to us, we've received one or two more texts, and we'll take some texts now.
Yeah, sure. We've had a text from Ashok who said people from poor countries will try to better themselves and come to the West where the standard of living is far higher. The border should be tightened, and that's from Ashok. Thanks, Ashok. Similar to what we were just saying, that there needs to be a kind of exit strategy and an entrance strategy.
It's interesting, isn't it, that this is now seen as a destination of prosperity, whereas originally, not too long ago, only a matter of a few hundred years ago, the people of this nation left to go to other countries where the lives were better and where resources were better and where other spices and riches could be found. And now it's completely the other way, isn't it?
I think it's always changing. I think there's always, a group of people always moving around the world, and I don't think there's anything actually wrong with that. We're here because of that, really.
Yeah. Definitely.
I mean, from a spiritual perspective, there are no borders, are there?
No.
Right? There are no lines drawn between nations, and there are no oceans. It's all one great big mass of water. And yet, somewhere along the line, this habit of naming and drawing out little marks and ring fencing countries and putting borders in place, and everything else came into play, didn't it?
Yeah, so go where you want. It's all love.
Yes, sir. So if you'd like to participate, you can text us on 07961 387787, or indeed you can call us and join us live 0208 472 9292, or on Twitter at nusound92FM.
We've also got a new Facebook page as well, which is www.facebook.com/A Reasonable Conversation. Do join our Facebook page, and you can share with us topics and ideas and future discussions. So please do join that. We've also had another text in from Kamlesh, who said, "The ones who complain were once immigrants themselves and were welcomed here. So stop complaining and enjoy the diversity in this country." It's a great text message. Thank you, Kamlesh.
Thank you very much, Kamlesh, for that. And in fact, if you expand on that thought, we've had Vikings come here, we've had Norse come here, we've had the Huns and all sorts of other people come onto these islands.
Exactly.
So, yeah, as one of our earlier callers said, what is an Englishman?
True. You're tuned into A Reasonable Conversation on New Sound Radio 92 FM. Welcome back, and we've been talking about immigration.
Yeah, we had an interesting text in from Kamlesh just a few minutes ago, and I think she touched on an argument which hasn't really been made. She mentioned diversity. You know, there's a good thing about diversity, and I think culture is a reason why a lot of people feel uncomfortable with immigration.
The threat to culture.
The threat to culture, yeah. I mean, diversity is a good thing, but is it always? And is it? Do you want complete diversity?
I think it's good if you can share in each other's cultures and the good things about other people's cultures, because it makes you more culturally enriched. But I think if there are cultural aspects which don't really sit well with the British culture, then people do feel quite fearful of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that might be a big part of, there's been quite a few EDL demonstrations near where I live, and it's, that's all about identity. A lot of people feel very strongly that the British identity is threatened because certain cultures don't fit in or don't make an effort to integrate.
So it's more about fear of loss of personal culture. Yeah, things coming in which require you to change and you don't want to change? Or is it because... And if it was something in your own culture which was being replaced by something that was superior, and it was obviously superior and better...
but what is superior?
Yeah, you see, that's the issue, isn't it? Who decides what's superior?
Well, it's the difference between fish and chips and... Aloo Bengan, for example. Right? No, I wouldn't. I would say that's a positive development if everybody was eating more aloo parathe and stuff like this, as opposed to fish and chips.
But then where do you draw the line, though? Because, I mean, in Britain, we drink alcohol. There is a culture where, you go to the pub on a Friday. I mean, it's now a Thursday, where everyone goes out drinking after work. And if there are people from different cultures who are saying, they're trying to ban alcohol consumption, say, in East London, and people drinking on the street, they're trying to enforce Sharia law, which is something that the news have picked up on. I mean, isn't that a bad thing? Because there
does seem to be something wrong. You're right, Prerna, with, a country and its people letting people in, and then the hosts being threatened by the beliefs and the ideas and the values of the visitors, as it were.
Exactly. I mean, and alcohol, it's bad for you, blah, blah, blah. But then if people want to have a drink in this country, it's a free democratic society. They should be able to have a drink.
So that is one of the aspects which I think is always attached to the immigration argument, isn't it? The fear that people have, that what they value and they treasure their ancestry, their heritage, the way that their great-grandparents used to do things, that's all under threat when there's a foreign impetus coming in.
Yeah. I think...
if they don't share the values of people in this country, then it does create some sort of friction and people will be fearful of immigration.
But you've got to keep in mind, cultures aren't static. Cultures are always evolving, and it's through interactions with other cultures that they evolve, right? So it's a very difficult balancing act, like you were saying, we could make the transition to Aloo Bengan, which would be a great one, right? But, it's that fine line of what is a good transition and what is a bad transition, what's a good mix and what isn't a bad mix.
Yeah. Exactly, and we need to remember there's immigrant communities living in the UK who can't speak English. They all stay within their community members and they don't integrate. So obviously people would be fearful of immigration, thinking, well, what's the point of coming to our country and then not learning our language and our way of life and integrating with us?
Yeah, not contributing. I think that's another thing a lot of people feel uncomfortable about.
That's really well identified, isn't it? So at the heart of it, is it a fear of people wanting to change you as opposed to wanting to join in with the culture that's evolved here over a long period of time? Well, it's strange. Perhaps people have seen that Vladimir Putin has sort of stepped into this space as well.
He has.
I think not so long ago, the Australian Premier also stepped forward, and the essence of what they've said is pretty much the same. That is, we don't need minorities. Minorities need us. I think his comments were, Russia is full of Russians and we don't need minorities. And minorities need us. If you don't want to come here and be Russian, then don't come. And it was very much echoing the sentiment that the Australian Premier also expressed. Exactly. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, it's actually been met with a great deal of support from their own host populations.
No, sure, but you know, you say that, and then there's other issues. There's the flip side of that recently, with the views on gay people, which has been publicised an awful lot in Russia. You know, and there's this sentiment outside of Russia that this is something that should be allowed and that this is okay, and so people are feeling uncomfortable with Russia having this idea of what is and isn't appropriate in Russia.
That can be another conversation because we can speak hours about it. But yeah, it's a good point. I mean, what is acceptable and what is integrating? We just had a text in from an anonymous texter. He said they are only here for the benefits and money. So
okay, so obviously
not that Underwingen then.
No. So people do come here because, as Gopal mentioned and we spoke about earlier, England's seen as a soft touch. So they come here, they don't want to integrate, they just want to take from society.
Yeah, and economically there is a very sound precedent, isn't there, where people have come here as migrant workers, and rather than the money that they earn being put back into the economy and circulating and creating wealth and growth, it just goes straight out of the economy into the third world countries, but also into European countries. And the Polish experience was very much the same, wasn't it?
I mean, but is there anything wrong with that? I mean, you think about it, right? I mean, a lot of Indian families I know have had this in previous generations.
Yeah.
And the impact seems to be, a few generations down, it's likely that they're going to send their kids to British universities or to live here anyway. So it's
exactly, and they're still paying tax on the money they earn here, so they are still contributing.
And I'm quite sure the amount that they've taken out in total is an awful lot less than some of the financial services bankers and people of that sort.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not going to go there.
Let's not go there. But they contribute to society. Like everyone who works here does contribute in some way.
But I think the argument the point that you raised earlier on is absolutely spot on. I think it's a knee-jerk, deeply held fear, isn't it, of change, that something's going to come in, I'm going to have to change, and it's a change that I don't want to really change towards.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. But that's changing as well, isn't it? Because we have the internet and we have TVs, and there is such a flow of culture and knowledge and religion and spiritual aspects flowing right through the whole world at the moment, isn't there? And if anything, that's going to get rid of these borders. Makes you wonder, are the politicians going to be the last people to realise that this erosion is going on? The world is moving ahead at a pace faster than they themselves
I think they do know. I think politicians do know. In defence of politicians out there who are listening in.
It's a difficult thing to do anything against, though, right? You can't control the internet. Well, unless you're North Korea.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the show. Thank you for all our listeners. Thanks for our callers, and thanks for texting in. Do stay tuned to next time, where we'll be talking about dual heritage marriages, and I'll be joined with Baram Singh and Harper Gill from City Sikhs.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for everyone participating, and we look forward to joining you on dual heritage marriages.
Yeah, thanks for listening. See you next week.